My name is Gabriel Hart, 40, an urban planner. I measure space for a living, and the small errors in grids bother me in a way other people do not notice. Alina is 35, born in Lisbon, courteous with strangers and private about herself. Mara, our daughter, is 9 and keeps the house honest by asking direct questions at breakfast. The story begins on a late November Thursday when rain turned the city into one long, reflective seam and a brass key fell from a coat into the laundry basket. It was an ordinary object with an extraordinary implication, a stamped number, a scuffed plastic tag from a part of the city Alina never mentioned. I put the key in my pocket because denial is a short, practical thing. I put it in the drawer because I had daughters to tuck into bed and a morning meeting to keep. Then the details began to aggregate the way a map builds when you overlay a dozen small, consistent traces. Taxi receipts tucked in jacket pockets, a courier slip with a signature I did not recognize, a management leaflet stamped with Unit 4B, and a surname that matched Elena's. Details move from anomaly to argument when someone insists on patterns, so I began to watch. I followed without drama, not because I wanted spectacle, but to collect proof. I sat in a nondescript rental car and watched Elena cross a bridge she had never told me she used, walk a block I did not know she walked, and enter a narrow building whose lobby smelled like lemon cleaner and other people's evenings. She did not enter alone. A man in a dark scarf met her on the steps. They spoke for a breath and passed inside together. From across the street I took photographs, the angle of her head, the position of his hand on her sleeve, the small way she leaned that I had not seen at home in years. I did not rush to accusations. I cataloged the timestamp of the photograph, the taxi company name on a crumpled slip, a courier sheet that read, Elena Pereira, Unit 4B. At dinner, I was present enough for Mara, present enough to applaud when she ran for the school recital, present enough to hug and tuck and keep an ordinary cadence. After Mara slept, I placed the photographs on the kitchen table and the brass key beside them, like evidence on a surgeon's tray. Elena came in smelling faintly of coffee and a coat that had belonged to someone else. I said calmly, "Tell me about 4B." She picked up the pictures as if they were lightweight things and smiled the way people smile when they are trying to keep a crack from widening. "You found a key," she said. "You found a key and you made it into a story." Her voice was careful in the way practiced lies become careful. It was not the sound of someone surprised, but of someone who expected discovery and had prepared an answer. "Friends," she said. "I visit friends, Gabriel." I looked at her and asked one small, precise question. Who is he? The question was not an instrument of blame so much as a scalpel that invited a name. She hesitated long enough for the room to name its own silence. "It's complicated," she answered finally, the phrase a shield honed by habit. "If you make a thing public, you will hurt Mara. Are you willing to hurt our daughter for this?" She tried to reverse the charge with pity, and pity is an effective armor because it looks like mercy. For a moment, I considered admitting a crack in my composure, considered pleading or smashing the photographs. Instead, I set my jaw and said nothing further. Denial and pity are useful weapons for the person who wants to remain in place. They are equally useful as temptations for the person who wants to escalate. I did neither. I left the photographs where they were and put the key in my jacket pocket, feeling its small weight like a metronome. Over the next weeks, I became deliberate, not frantic. I recorded delivery schedules. I learned the cadence of lights at Unit 4B. I registered the pattern of taxis that arrived and left on certain evenings. I bought a cheap disposable camera and slipped it into a jacket I knew she would wear, not to catch a moment for social sharing, but to assemble undeniable sequences, timestamps, angles, consistent corroboration, rather than a single contested image. I did not want spectacle. I wanted structure. By the time the first part of this story closed, I had enough proof to make a private file of claims, photographs, receipts, a tenancy record, and not yet decided on the shape of my answer. I understood only this. Vengeance, if it came, would be a measured thing, practical and cold rather than loud. I kept the key in my pocket like a small promise and a warning, and I learned that the most dangerous kind of patience is the kind that is patient enough to plan.
The file grew in silence, tucked behind architectural blueprints in my office drawer, and with every page the weight of the secret apartment pressed heavier. Elena moved as if nothing shifted. The school run, the market lists, the polite laughter at my colleagues' jokes during the winter gala. She never faltered in performance, and if I had been any other husband, perhaps I would have let the illusion win. but I am trained to notice irregular alignments, and I could not ignore how every Thursday she vanished after 4 and returned near midnight with the scent of cologne that was not mine, clinging faintly to her scarf. I tested boundaries. I told her I had late meetings when I did not. I asked casually what her friend's name was, the one she visited so faithfully. She lied with such precision that I felt almost admiration for the craftsmanship. "Mariana," she said one evening, slicing peppers as though the act of preparation erased deceit. I asked, "Does Mariana live in 4B?" She froze only long enough to reveal the answer I already owned. She covered quickly, but cracks multiply when light insists. I followed Elena again, more closely, walking a block behind. The man with the dark scarf opened the door for her, his hand grazing her back as if it were a ritual. I memorized his face, the length of his stride, the way he leaned down to kiss her cheek in the lobby before they ascended the stairs. Later, through discreet inquiries and a careful search of property records, I found his name. Daniel Ward, 38, a project consultant. His name tasted metallic in my mouth, like blood I refused to spit out. With each discovery, my restraint sharpened. I did not confront her again. Confrontation gives a liar the advantage of rehearsal. Instead, I tracked patterns, the dates she stayed longer, the hours he left first, the rhythm of their double life. I became invisible in my own house, a presence she assumed was fixed, while in truth I lived elsewhere, in notes, in evidence, in cold anticipation. One night, Mara asked why I stared so long at the map on my desk. "Because maps tell the truth," I answered. "They don't lie about where the streets lead." She accepted this with a child's faith, but the irony was a knife. Elena believed her lies could bend reality. I believed structure would expose it. The plan began to form when I discovered Daniel's firm worked with the same municipal board that contracted my office. Professional overlap meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant leverage. Revenge, I knew, must not only wound the heart but also dismantle the foundation that allowed betrayal to thrive. To punish Elena was one aim, but to fracture the man who thought himself untouchable was another. I started small, discreetly photographing Daniel leaving 4B at dawn, slipping into taxis, meeting with colleagues. I purchased a second phone under a false name and began collecting numbers, arranging them like coordinates. At home, Elena kissed Mara goodnight and returned to the kitchen where I sat with papers that looked like blueprints but were maps of her deceit. "You're quiet these days," she said, offering a faint smile that almost passed as concern. I studied her face and replied, "Quiet men see everything." She blinked, unsure whether it was warning or confession, but she let it slide because comfort is easier than suspicion. Inside me, comfort was long dead. I did not crave explosive retribution. I wanted Elena to realize too late that every lie had been dissected, every step cataloged, and every escape sealed. By the end of that winter, I knew precisely how I would answer, not with a confrontation in our kitchen, but with a sequence of moves that would strip her of safety, dignity, and the illusion of control she clung to. The secret apartment was not just her sanctuary anymore, it was my trap. And she walked into it night after night, unaware the walls were closing in.
The plan moved from observation to orchestration, where once I collected facts, now I manufactured pressure and let it act like a solvent on brittle loyalties. I rented, under a business alias, an office near Daniel Ward's consulting firm and used it as a staging ground for small, surgical disruptions. An anonymous email to the partner who handled contracts suggesting a conflict of interest, a sealed complaint to the firm's HR flagged for financial irregularities, a photographed copy of a courier receipt slipped into a mailbox with no return name, all designed to make the firm's leadership look twice at Daniel's books and movements. I was careful. Every fabricated trace I left mirrored the types of documentation I already possessed, so that when auditors asked for corroboration, the disparate pieces would seem to converge, not contradict. At home, I remained inscrutable. Elena maintained dinner routines and school runs, but she began to misplace words in conversation, to ask where I had placed my keys, to look at me with a question behind her eyes. My file grew fat with pins, meeting logs, a bank transfer time-stamped unusually late, a photograph of Daniel accepting a package from a courier that matched the leaflet with her name. I planted a rumor with a colleague I knew was close to Daniel, a carefully worded suggestion that Daniel had been diverting small project funds to a separate account. The colleague passed it on because he was a man who feared being implicated by proximity. Fear spreads faster than truth. Within a fortnight, the firm instituted an internal review. Daniel seemed blindsided in public, but I watched him in the shadows of his lobby, shaking with an anger he could not yet direct. The subtlety of my moves had an arithmetic. For every rumor I started, I left a breadcrumb of evidence that made the rumor credible. Meanwhile, I kept Elena shielded from exposure as long as possible. I wanted her to understand the architecture of loss, not to be humiliated by spectacle. One evening, she found a typed note on our kitchen counter with a single line, "I know where you go, and I know who waits." Her face shifted from confusion to calculation in a way that made my pulse slow, because she finally understood the problem was not chance. She accused me then, not with tears but with a tight voice that belonged to the woman who had practiced containment for years. "Are you following me?" she asked, the syllables precise, somehow both accusation and plea. I answered with two truths and no mercy. "I followed you. I am following him." The admission landed like a measured blow. She tried to shape it into negotiation. "If you want me gone, just say so. We can fix this quietly." Her tone implied trade, a bargaining with lives. "I don't want you gone," I said. "I want you to see." That was not the whole of it. I wanted accountability, and I wanted the man she chose to understand consequences that reached beyond stolen afternoons. My moves began to affect other people in ways I had predicted and some I had not. Daniel's clients started asking for alternate consultants. His schedule grew thin. A subcontractor called me by mistake and spilled a piece of information about a pending audit I had not engineered, but gladly used. Elena, cornered by the reduction of Daniel's world, began to press him to cut ties with the apartment and be more careful. I listened to their conversations at a distance, through a crack in timing and a camera lens, and I heard not tender words, but tactical whispers. How to reroute messages, which nights to avoid taxis. The pity she once weaponized returned to her as panic. She began to ration explanations at home, to speak in deflections when Mara was present. One night, when she thought our daughter asleep, she asked me in a voice that had the tremor of someone who feared the next move, "If you have all this, why haven't you told me? Why not call and end it?" The question was a trap. The easy answer would have been confession, a sudden collapse that might have opened a path to mercy. Instead, I replied with the quiet arithmetic of revenge. "Because some things must be dismantled piece by piece," I said. "You built a life on a secret. I am taking it down in daylight so that what remains cannot be rebuilt on lies." My words were not about hurting her for pain's sake, but about removing the scaffolding of deception so nothing could be patched over. The firm announced an external audit of Daniel's accounts and froze several ongoing bids. His professional reputation, which had been the scaffolding of his confidence, began to fray. Elena complained about the sudden absence of Daniel's evenings, the postponed calls. Her voice sometimes cracked in a way that made me want to reach across the table and touch the person she had been before she taught herself strategies of concealment. I did not touch her. I cataloged patience differently now. I measured the time between revelation and fallout, the interval in which a human being recalibrates identity under pressure. The net I had knitted was closing around two lives at once, and in the tightening, I felt a strange ambivalence, relief laced with a long, cold grief. The next move, I decided, would not be merely professional. It would involve the place she called sanctuary and the man she had treated as an ultimate truth. I would not rush. I had learned that when you manage events like architectural projects, you must anticipate load, weak points, and where collapse could do damage beyond intention. I planned then not only to expose, but to unmake, to take the secret apartment and render it a public proof of the life Elena had hidden, to force a reckoning that would strip pretense clean and leave only facts standing.
The unmaking began with small administrative moves that looked accidental to anyone who glanced and deliberate to those who read the margins. I filed an anonymous request for a landlord inspection at Unit 4B, citing a suspected safety hazard.
then followed the procedure with an anonymous tip to the housing registry about an unregistered sublet that might breach municipal codes. The complaint triggered a standard visit, and inspector in a hard hat, clipboard at the ready, who expected a cramped, hurried explanation and found instead an empty apartment, scattered mugs, a shoe left at an odd angle, a half-packed tote with Alina's initials. The inspector issued a notice. Unsafe wiring, possible unlicensed occupancy. A fine would follow if the leaseholder did not produce documentation within a week. I watched Elena when I told her the news, with the care of a man who counts reactions like measurements. She paled, then measured her faces for a response. "Maybe there was a mistake," she said, voice low, as if bargaining could rearrange municipal procedure. "I can call the manager." She did not yet know how many avenues already had my fingerprints on them. Parallel to the inspection, I leaked a photograph of Daniel leaving the building, one of mine, discreet and undeniable, to an old acquaintance of his who wrote for a local paper. The photograph arrived with a short note suggesting the man had been seen frequenting a residential unit under questionable terms. The reporter, always hungry for a pattern that fit a civic interest, asked for comment. I provided nothing more than a confirmation that yes, Daniel had contracts in the city, and yes, civic oversight might care. The story ran a week later as a small column about municipal oversight and the complications of consultants maintaining private residences in zones not meant for them. The article quoted the housing registry's announcement of an inquiry and reproduced the photograph with a neutral caption. For Daniel, it was a pinprick. For Elena, it was a blow that exposed intimacy to public scrutiny. At home, she grew thin, with a kind of frantic economy, burying her face in lists and logistics, trying to predict which paper trail I had touched. One evening, when Mara was at a friend's for a sleepover, Elena confronted me in the kitchen with the rawness of a person who had run out of safe explanations. "Who are you trying to hurt, Gabriel?" she asked. "Is this about punishment or something else?" Her eyes were bloodshot in a way that complicated my resolve. I set down my coffee and met her directly. "This is about truth," I said. "You and Daniel built a life on concealment. I am dismantling the structures that let that lie live." She laughed then, because laughter is a shield and a small rebellion. "You sound like a prosecutor," she said. "Do you even know what you're doing to us?" "I know what you did to us. There's a ledger, and the entries are yours." She stepped closer and lowered her voice until it was a whisper that asked for mercy and complicity simultaneously. "Tell me what you want," she said. "If you want me to leave, I will. I will take Mara and go." Her words were both sword and surrender. She offered exile as if it were a convenience. I looked at her and felt the architecture of my life, the blueprints, the planned schools, the evenings I had imagined unremarkable, tilt. "I want something else," I said. "I want accountability. I want the man you betrayed our family with to understand the cost. I want you to see what a life built on secret rooms does to the people who live in the rest of it." My answer was precise and cold, because sympathy would have been a currency she spent easily. The housing notice escalated. The landlord served a citation. Daniel, now under a cloud at his firm because of the audit and the small article, began to look unstable in ways I intended. His calls to Elena grew urgent. They argued in whispers that vibrated thin through the building when I sat in my car 2 blocks away and watched the lights go off in sequence. I began to stage small exposures that did not scream, but revealed. A postcard slipped under the office door of one of Daniel's partners with a photograph of a delivery signature. An email sent anonymously to a client with a question about Daniel's availability for a major bid, flagged with a suggestion of potential conflict. Each act was a chess move that pushed him into isolation. As Daniel's professional certainty eroded, he made mistakes, missed meetings, terse replies, a visible tremor in conversation that a colleague later described as off. News of a municipal citation and an internal audit travels differently in a city of small reputations. Soon Daniel was not only fighting bureaucratic probes, but whispers among peers. Elena began to feel the pressure in a way that no private apology could erase. She tried to reason with him. "Well, lie low," she told him once, voice frayed. "We'll stop using 4B. He answered with the rough edge of someone who had not imagined consequences so physical. "I'm not giving up contracts because of a scare. You think I can afford to lose bids for this?" Their pragmatism betrayed them. His anger at being stripped of security made him reckless, and recklessness leaves traces. I kept a ledger of those traces and folded them into a dossier I would not release all at once. My aim was not to push Elena into destitution, but to make the life she thought she owned impossible to sustain. I wanted her to watch the scaffold she climbed dismantle itself, while the people who had been hurt, most of all Mara, stood outside the collapse. The next move would involve proving to the firm and to the landlord that the apartment was not simply an ambiguous arrangement, but a deliberate concealment tied to payments and favors. To do that, I would need a final piece of evidence, a record that joined the private and the professional. I planned for it with the care of a man who had learned to see how small forces compound into ruin.
The end came not as a scream, but as a sequence of administrative defeats that accumulated until there was nothing left to prop the secret life. I took the dossier I had built, receipts, tenancy records, time-stamped photographs, the courier slips that bore Elena's name, the audit correspondences, and the sanitary inspection notice, and delivered it to 3 places at once: Daniel's firm with a formal request for a complete review and copies of questionable invoices, the landlord with proof of unregistered subletting and payment traces that suggested someone else had been underwriting the unit, and a local journalist whose beat was municipal corruption, and who understood how to turn an obscure scandal into municipal consequence without turning it into a spectacle about private sorrow. I did not feed gossip. I presented documentation and asked questions that bureaucracies could not ignore. The firm initiated a formal investigation, the landlord began eviction proceedings, and the journalist published a measured piece that did not pity or vilify, but laid out incontrovertible facts. Daniel's bids were suspended, clients asked for replacements, and the firm's board called for a review of projects that had crossed his desk. The landlord, faced with papers that suggested unlicensed occupancy and payments that did not match the lease, issued a notice that made the unit untenable. Elena woke the morning the eviction notice arrived like a person surprised by a weather change she had not forecasted. She read and folded the paper with the mechanical grace of someone cataloging loss. For the first time since the key fell into the laundry, she looked smaller than the problem she had made. She turned to me, not with the practiced shield she had used before, but with an exposed, immediate question: "What now?" I could have answered with triumph or with a recrimination that would satisfy a different hunger. Instead, I took a breath the way a builder measures a new span before laying steel. "Now you fix what you broke," I said. "Start by telling Mara the truth on her terms. Then we decide what comes after." She protested, bargaining for exile with our daughter. "Let me take her, Gabe. We will go. I'll make do." Her plea was both attempt at avoidance and a raw entreaty. I understood the practicalities of such a fracture: school changes, legal filings, children's rooms emptied and moved, and I understood the moral limits I would not cross. "You gave me a life that included you," I said quietly. "You decided to divide it without consent. That means I am responsible now for keeping what is left whole." We spoke to a counsel I trusted, not as weapon nor as ritual, but to create a plan that protected Mara first. Temporary custody arrangements were made with the clear expectation of stability for our child, while the legal and professional consequences for Elena and Daniel unfolded. The legal world moved in its own tempo: hearings, statements, a small civil suit from Daniel's firm that sought to quantify reputational damage and recover misallocated funds, a suit that, ironically, ended in part because the very paper trail I had provided. Daniel, facing an internal tribunal and the fast withdrawal of clients, resigned before the board forced his hand. His reputation dissolved, not with melodrama, but with a slow unspooling of trust among people who trade on reliability.
Elena lost the apartment, and with it the illusion that secrecy could be kept at no cost. She moved out with the measured indignity of someone who has to learn how to live under daylight again, finding temporary lodging with a cousin while she attempted to rebuild. For Mara, the rupture was less a scandal than a reorientation. Afternoons that had been split between two routines consolidated into one steady place where homework and piano practice returned to a reliable schedule. Children are mercilessly practical about safety. She wanted clean laundry, packed lunches, a father who turned up at her recital and did not disappear into plots. I gave her those things. In the months that followed, I discovered how fatigue and relief can be siblings. There were nights I sat in our living room with the blueprints I loved and realized I had used the discipline of my work to do a kind of moral architecture, to take away unsafe supports and rebuild a span that would hold. Friends called, some with curiosity, others with the kind of silence that suggests recalculation. I answered those calls because life demands ordinary courtesies even when its axis has shifted. Elena attempted, awkwardly and intermittently, to explain herself to Mara in a way that accepted culpability without decoration. Those conversations were private and uncomfortable and sometimes necessary. I refused to orchestrate her humiliation, but also would not allow sympathy to become a disguise for absence of responsibility. Months later, in a small hearing that decided temporary arrangements and next steps, the judge looked at the files and at us and asked simply where Mara's stability lay. The answer was procedural and human at once. School, friends, the rhythm of a household where beds were made and meals planned. The judge awarded primary custody with supervised visitation for Elena for a season, emphasizing therapy and restitution as conditions for broader access. It was not a triumph so much as a practical outcome that protected the child and allowed the adults to recalibrate. Life after betrayal does not offer tidy catharsis. It offers labor, paperwork, therapy sessions, the slow rebuilding of trust in small increments. I kept my job, and in the quiet spaces left by the collapse, I found work that nourished rather than consumed. Lectures on urban ethics, a column in a local journal about the importance of transparency in both cities and relationships. I met someone later, gradually. Not a cure, but a companion who matched the careful way I now repaired things. Mara grew into a child who asked better questions and expected clearer answers. She learned that adults can fail and also be corrected. Elena made attempts at restitution that were halting and imperfect. She found a modest job, attended counseling, and in time sought to rebuild a life that did not depend on furtive rooms. My revenge had been precise, not vengeful for spectacle, but engineered to remove the scaffolding of deceit. In its wake, I did not find victory in humiliation, but the quieter return of order, and a renewed sense of stewardship over the things I loved most. The brass key, which had begun this arc, sat in a small wooden box on my desk for a long time. I opened the box once, ran the key through my fingers, and then locked it away. The city kept its rain and its seams. I kept my daughter safe, and that, in the end, felt like enough.